The proudest man in Caldwell County had just knelt, not before an enemy, but before a promissory note and a name he never wanted to hear. Silas Mercer, heir to the largest ranch in the region, was given an undeniable choice: marry Clementine Ashcroft, the woman the entire county mocked, or lose the land his father had shed blood to protect. The whole town waited to see his downfall, but no one saw what Clementine had been silently preparing. Like and comment the name of the city you're viewing so I know how far this story has progressed, and then follow along to the end. The notice arrived on a Tuesday, which Silas Mercer would later think was the cruelest part of it. Not a Monday, when a man might still have the weekend stubbornness in him. Not a Friday, when he could at least drink through the weekend and pretend the world hadn't shifted. A Tuesday. Plain, unremarkable, the kind of day that had no business carrying news that rearranged a man's entire life. He was in the south pasture when his foreman, Deke Holloway, rode out with the envelope. Deke was 63 years old and had worked the Mercer land since before Silas was born. He'd survived droughts, stampedes, one accidental shooting, and a flash flood that took 3 good horses and a year's worth of fence posts. Deke Holloway did not rattle easily, but the way he held that envelope, at arm's length like it might bite, told Silas everything he needed to know before he broke the wax seal. He read it twice, then he folded it, put it in his shirt pocket, and went back to checking the fence line. He worked for another 2 hours without saying a word. Deke rode alongside him in silence, which was one of the things Silas had always respected about the old man. It was only when the sun started dropping toward the western ridge that Silas finally spoke. "How much does the crew know?" "Nothing from me," Deke said. "But Harlan Teague was at the bank yesterday. You know how that man talks." Silas exhaled through his nose. Harlan Teague was the biggest gossip between the Rio Grande and the Red River, and he worked for nobody useful. By now the news was probably halfway to Abilene. The letter was from Reginald Ashcroft, Clementine's father, though most people in Caldwell County knew him simply as the money behind half the county's debt. Ashcroft hadn't built anything himself, not in the way that Silas's father and grandfather had built the Mercer Ranch with their hands and their backs and considerable suffering. Ashcroft had arrived 20 years ago with a briefcase full of promissory notes and a patience that bordered on predatory. He'd waited out 3 droughts and 2 cattle panics, buying low and lending high, and now he held mortgages on 11 properties in the county, the Mercer Ranch among them. The letter was polite in the way that only very dangerous things can afford to be polite. "Mr. Mercer," it began, "as you are aware, the note on the Mercer property, principal and accumulated interest, comes due on the 1st of October. I have given considerable thought to the matter and wish to propose an alternative arrangement that may be of mutual benefit." The arrangement was simple. Silas Mercer would marry Reginald Ashcroft's daughter, Clementine. In exchange, Ashcroft would forgive the debt entirely and transfer the mortgage deed back to Silas free and clear. If Silas declined, the note would be called in full on October 1st, and if he could not produce the sum, which, as they both knew, he could not, the ranch would revert to Ashcroft by the terms of the original agreement. Silas had until Friday to respond. He rode back to the house and sat on the porch until the stars came out, which was something his mother used to do when she needed to think. The ranch was quiet in the way it got at the end of summer, a dry, heavy quiet that felt like the land holding its breath. He could hear the creek running low at the eastern edge of the property, barely a trickle now compared to what it should have been. The cattle were thin. The hay stores wouldn't carry them through a hard winter, and the market price for beef had dropped twice in the past year. He'd known the situation was bad. He hadn't known it was this bad. Silas Mercer was 34 years old and had never married, not because women hadn't been interested. He was tall and steady-looking, with a face that had weathered well, but because he'd always believed he'd have more time. His father had married at 40, his grandfather at 38. The Mercer men were not men who rushed, but none of the Mercer men had accumulated this particular kind of debt either. He thought about Clementine Ashcroft. He'd seen her a handful of times over the years, mostly at county functions that he attended out of obligation, and she seemed to attend out of something else entirely, some private errand he couldn't quite read. She was a large woman, heavier than was considered fashionable, with dark hair she kept pinned back in a practical style, and brown eyes that were, as far as Silas could tell, always watching something that everyone else had missed. She was not loud. She did not push herself into conversations. She dressed plainly, which surprised people given her father's wealth, and she had a habit of sitting at the edges of rooms rather than in the center of them. The things people said about her were not kind. He'd heard poor Clementine more times than he could count. He'd heard worse than that too, said by men who thought cruelty was the same as wit. She'd been the subject of jokes at the saloon, at the feed store, at church socials. Jokes about her size, her plainness, her unmarried state, her apparent indifference to the opinions of everyone around her. She was 30 years old, people said, as if that were a verdict. She'd never had a serious suitor, people said, as if that were her failure rather than the county's. Silas had never participated in any of it, but he hadn't stopped it either, which was a different kind of fault. He went to bed that night and stared at the ceiling and thought about his father, who had worked this land for 30 years and died with calloused hands, and a satisfaction that Silas had never quite managed to name, but had always wanted to earn. He thought about the men who worked for him, Deke and the others, 8 of them in all, who had families and roofs and horses and livelihoods tied to this particular piece of ground. He thought about the east pasture, which his grandfather had cleared by hand, and the barn his father had built twice because the first one had burned in a lightning storm, and the man had simply gotten up and built it again. He sent his response on Thursday, 1 day early. The wedding took place on a Saturday in late September in the Ashcroft parlor, with a judge Silas didn't know presiding and only a handful of witnesses. Clementine's father stood to one side with an expression of satisfied neutrality, like a man who'd just concluded a business arrangement that had gone exactly as planned, which, Silas supposed, was precisely what had happened. Clementine wore a dress the color of winter cream. It fit her well and looked expensive, though she hadn't fussed about it. She'd walked into the room already dressed, hair pinned, gloves on, as if she'd been ready for an hour and had been waiting patiently for everyone else to catch up. She did not carry flowers. She did not seem nervous. Silas had expected nervousness. He'd expected some evidence that this was as strange for her as it was for him. Instead, she stood beside him with a stillness that he found, in some confused way, almost unsettling. Not cold. She wasn't cold exactly, but composed in a way that suggested she had already thought through everything that was about to happen and had made her peace with it. He hadn't made his peace with it. He was still, despite his best efforts to be a reasonable man, furious. The judge read the words. Silas said what he was supposed to say. Clementine said what she was supposed to say, in a clear, even voice that didn't waver. When it was done, Reginald Ashcroft shook Silas's hand with a grip that was meant to remind him of the power differential, and then the deed was signed over, and Silas Mercer was a married man with a clear title and a wife he didn't want, and a hollow feeling in his chest that he suspected might take a long time to fill. Clementine shook her father's hand rather than embracing him, which struck Silas as odd. Ashcroft's expression flickered briefly, but he said nothing. The county found out before nightfall. In the weeks that followed, the jokes were relentless. It was the feed store first. Silas had the misfortune of arriving on a Monday morning when 4 ranchers he'd known his whole life were gathered near the counter, and the silence that fell when he walked in was the particular kind of silence that meant he'd been the subject of whatever had just been said. Old Pete Garver recovered first. Silas, heard the news. Congratulations. And then, just barely under his breath, the addition that made the other men swallow smiles. You're a brave man. At the saloon, a man Silas barely knew had apparently spent an evening constructing a joke about the Mercer Ranch being well stocked now that Silas had added to the herd. Deke told him about it secondhand, and to Deke's credit, he looked genuinely disgusted as he repeated it. Silas listened without expression and then went out and split firewood for an hour until his arms ached and the worst of it had burned through him. The women were quieter about it, which in some ways was worse. There was a particular kind of sympathy being extended to him in county stores and church doorways and casual encounters at the post office, a sympathy that positioned him as the victim of circumstances, as a good man brought low by financial misfortune into a union that everyone agreed was a sacrifice. Nobody said it outright. They said it with the way they looked at him, with a softness that was somehow more insulting than Garver's smirk. Nobody said anything about Clementine because nobody had to. She had moved into the ranch house with 3 trunks, a crate of books, and a rolled leather case that Silas eventually discovered contained technical survey maps of the surrounding county. She'd taken the smaller bedroom. He'd offered her the larger one, but she'd said the light was better in the small one, which turned out to be true in a way he hadn't considered. She cooked breakfast without being asked, and it was better than what he'd been making for himself, though he wasn't about to say so. She stayed out of his way, and he stayed out of hers. And for the first 2 weeks, this arrangement had the quality of 2 people living in cautious orbit around each other. He waited for her to complain, for her to make demands, to assert her father's influence, to use the financial leverage of the arrangement in some way that would confirm the resentment he was carrying around like a stone in his boot. She didn't. She read her books in the evenings. She took long walks in the mornings, sometimes very early, before the hands were up, covering ground that Silas would have said she couldn't manage, but which she covered without apparent difficulty. She asked Deke a great many questions about the water situation on the eastern quarter, and listened to his answers with a focus that made Deke, who was not easily impressed, look uncertain about whether he'd underestimated something. The first real conversation Silas had with his wife happened on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the wedding. He'd come in from the south pasture with news that wasn't good. 2 more cattle with the particular wasting look that came from bad grass and not enough water, and a report from one of the hands about fence breaks on the eastern edge that suggested someone had cut them deliberately. He dropped into the chair at the kitchen table and said, without really thinking about it, "We've got a problem." Clementine looked up from the paper she was reading, which turned out, when Silas looked closer, to be a survey of the county water tables. "The eastern fence," she said. It wasn't a question. He stared at her. "How did you know that?" "I walked it yesterday morning." She set the papers down and folded her hands on the table. "The cuts are clean. Wire doesn't fray like that on its own. Somebody came through with a tool and took their time about it." Silas looked at her for a moment. She met his eyes steadily, without challenge, without any particular emotion he could identify. "You walked the eastern perimeter," he said. "That's 4 miles." "I walk quickly," she said. "Do you want to discuss who might have done it, or are you just going to be surprised at me for a while first?" He felt heat climb his neck. "I'm not surprised." She waited. "All right," he said. "I'm a little surprised." Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the acknowledgement of a point scored. "There are 3 men in this county who'd benefit from softening your herd's boundaries before winter. I have some thoughts about which one is most likely. Do you want to hear them, or would you prefer to approach this some other way?" Silas was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the dry smell of a range that hadn't had enough rain since April. "Go ahead," he said. The name she named first was Harlan Crow. Not Harlan Teague, the gossip. This was a different Harlan, which was, Silas sometimes thought, one of the county's persistent inconveniences. Harlan Crow was the largest landowner in the region who wasn't Reginald Ashcroft, and he'd been trying to expand his operations southward for the better part of a decade. The Mercer Ranch sat exactly where his expansion needed to go. There'd been bad blood between the Mercers and the Crow family since before Silas was born, rooted in a boundary dispute that had ended in a compromise that satisfied nobody. Crow's son, Whitfield, had escalated that bad blood into something with sharper edges. He'd tried to block the Mercer water rights twice in the county commission, unsuccessfully both times, and the second failure had left a visible mark on his face that suggested genuine hatred rather than mere business rivalry. "Whitfield Crow," Silas said. "You said Harlan, but you mean Whitfield." "I mean both," Clementine said. "Harlan sets the strategy. Whitfield carries it out. They're not separate problems." She pulled one of the survey maps from her stack, the county water table survey, and spread it on the table. "This is what you should be looking at. Not just the fence. The fence is just how they start. What they actually want is here." She put her finger on the map. "This aquifer feeds your eastern quarter and 3 adjacent properties. If they can push you off before winter and buy distressed land from your neighbors in the spring, they control the primary water source for this entire section of the county." Silas looked at the map. He'd grown up on this land, and he knew it in the way that you know something you've never had to think consciously about. the way he knew where the ground went soft after rain, where the grass grew thin over limestone, where the cattle preferred to shelter in wind. But the map showed him something he'd never quite assembled from all those pieces of knowledge. The shape of the water beneath all of it, the underground architecture that made the surface livable. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "I commissioned it," she said, "in July." "July was—" He stopped. "Before the wedding, yes." She pulled the map back and began rolling it carefully. "I had some months to prepare. I used them." He sat with that for a moment. Outside, one of the horses had gotten into something it didn't like and was making a low, discontented sound that eventually settled into silence. "You knew about your father's plan before July," Silas said. Clementine finished rolling the map and secured it with a leather tie. "I've known my father a long time," she said. And then, without any visible sign that the subject caused her the slightest difficulty, she moved on. "The water system on the eastern quarter needs to be rebuilt. Not repaired, rebuilt. What you have now was designed for a herd half the size you're running, and the drought has pushed it past its limits. I have some ideas about how to reconfigure it. Would you like to talk through them, or should we wait until you've had time to decide whether you trust me enough to discuss ranch business with me?" There it was, said plainly, without drama, but with enough precision that Silas understood it was intentional. She was naming the actual question because apparently she found it more efficient to name things than to dance around them. He thought about that for a moment. The resentment was still there. It was a stubborn thing, not easily dislodged by one conversation, but underneath it something had shifted, not gone, just complicated. "Talk me through the water system," he said. She talked him through it for 2 hours. Silas had gone to the kitchen table expecting to endure a presentation designed to impress rather than inform. He'd met that kind before, the eager young men from agricultural college who came through sometimes, full of theory and short on experience, who could tell you exactly why what you were doing was wrong, but couldn't tell you how to do it right in the actual dirt and heat and unpredictability of a working ranch. Clementine was nothing like that. She'd thought through the problem from the ground up, building her proposal from the specific conditions of this specific land, incorporating details that she'd only been able to observe in person. She knew where the ground was compacted and where it wasn't. She knew which sections got sun longest in the summer and which ran cold in the early months. She'd talked to Deke, she admitted, which explained some of it, but Deke had told Silas afterward that she'd asked him questions he'd never had to put words to before, had pulled information out of him that he'd carried wordlessly for 40 years. The water system she proposed was not simple or cheap. It would require new cisterns, regraded channels, and a distribution method that Silas had seen described in an agricultural journal but had never seen built. He said so. "I've seen one built," Clementine said, "in Kansas. It worked." "You've been to Kansas?" "Several times." She looked at him with a patience that was, he was beginning to understand, her default setting rather than something she deployed situationally. "My father travels for business. I traveled with him for years before I stopped." A pause, brief and clearly not open to exploration. "I saw things. I read things. I paid attention." "Why did you stop traveling with him?" She looked at him. Then she looked away, at the window, where the early autumn dark was complete against the glass. "Because I found out how his business worked," she said, "and I didn't want to watch it anymore." Silas didn't ask her to elaborate. He wasn't sure what it would mean later that this was the moment he started to see her as separate from Reginald Ashcroft, as something that was her own rather than an extension of the man who had engineered this marriage. But that was the moment. He could feel the line of it, even as it was happening. They went over the water system proposal until the lamp burned low. When it was clear the conversation was winding down, Clementine gathered her maps and papers and stood without ceremony, and Silas stood too, which was automatic, the habit of a man raised to stand when a woman stood. She noticed. He could tell, though she didn't make anything of it. "I'll write up the materials list," she said, "if you want to move forward." "Do it," he said. She nodded. She was almost to the hallway when he heard himself say, more honestly than he'd intended, "I didn't want this marriage." She stopped. She didn't turn around. "I know," she said. "I didn't either," Exactly. A pause. But we're in it. So. He couldn't see her face. He didn't know what the "so" meant, whether it was a dismissal or a proposal or just an acknowledgement of the plain fact of their situation. She walked down the hallway, and her door closed quietly behind her, and Silas stood in the kitchen and listened to the wind work at the windows. October arrived cold and early, which the old-timers said meant a hard winter, and the old-timers were right often enough to be taken seriously. The herd was still thin, the market still soft, and the reports from neighboring ranches were uniformly bleak. 3 families Silas had known his whole life were quietly negotiating with creditors. One was already gone, the Halverson place, sold to a holding company that nobody could quite trace, though the rumors pointed, as they usually did, toward Crow money moving through paper layers. Clementine had started the materials list. It had grown into something comprehensive, annotated in a hand that was small and even and extremely precise, with cost estimates that Silas checked against his own knowledge and found accurate. She'd accounted for things he wouldn't have thought to account for: the ground freeze timing, the particular weight-bearing capacity of the ridge where she wanted the largest cistern, the length of the project window before winter would make groundwork impossible. She'd also, without making a formal announcement about it, started talking to people. Silas found out about this gradually. A neighbor named Ed Farrow mentioned one afternoon that Clementine had stopped by his place to look at his water situation and had some interesting observations about the shared watershed. Ada Tillman, whose husband had died 2 years ago, leaving her running their place alone, said something at the feed store about a very sensible woman who came by on Tuesday. Deke reported that 2 of the hands had started talking to Clementine directly about the eastern fence situation, which wasn't remarkable except that neither of them were the type to initiate conversations with anyone they didn't already trust. She was doing something. Silas wasn't sure yet what exactly, but he had the sense that she'd arrived at this ranch with a much longer plan than the water cisterns, and that the water cisterns were just where she was starting. He didn't ask her about it directly. He wasn't ready for that conversation yet, and he had a feeling she knew it and was giving him time, which was, he admitted to himself in an honest moment, more consideration than the situation probably required her to give him. On a Friday evening in the second week of October, Silas was out at the barn past dark, dealing with a horse that had pulled a tendon and was not being cooperative about having it wrapped. He heard footsteps he recognized. Clementine had a particular walk, not heavy the way people seem to expect, but deliberate, with weight behind it. And then she was there with a lamp, holding it steady while he worked. "Thanks," he said. "The Tillman place is going to lose their north pasture by spring if nothing changes," she said. "They don't have the water for it." "I know. Ada's been working without enough help since Garrett died. If she could connect to the eastern reservoir, the one I want to build, it would carry both operations through a dry year." She held the lamp at the angle that gave him the best light. "I've been thinking about whether it makes sense to approach the neighboring families about a shared water project. The cost split would be significant. The benefit would be larger." Silas finished wrapping the horse's leg and stood up. He was close enough to her now to see her face clearly in the lamplight, and he noticed something he hadn't had occasion to notice before. She was watching him with a careful neutrality that cost her something. It wasn't indifference. It was the practiced stillness of someone who had learned not to show how much a response mattered. "How many families are you thinking?" he said. She exhaled, barely perceptibly. 5. To start. Maybe 7? It depends on who's willing. Some of them aren't going to be willing. There are men out here who'll chew their own leg off before they ask for help." "I know." She shifted the lamp slightly. "I'm not planning to ask them for help. I'm going to offer them a business arrangement. It's different." He looked at her. "You've thought about how to sell it." "I've thought about a lot of things," she said. "That's not particularly remarkable." "It is, a little," he said. And then, because it was evening and he was tired and the honest impulse had gotten ahead of his caution, "Most people in this county have you figured for somebody's quiet wife." She looked at him steadily. "I know what people in this county have me figured for," she said. "I've known it since I was 12 years old. I stopped letting it determine anything about me some time ago." He didn't answer right away. The horse shifted behind him, its breath clouding in the cold air. "How long have you known about Whitfield Crow's water scheme, Chaz?" he asked. 2 years. 2 years. He said it flatly, absorbing it. I told my father, she said. He wasn't interested in stopping it. He was weighing his own interests against yours and your neighbors, and you know how that calculation came out. Something crossed her face. Not quite anger, not quite sorrow, something more compressed than either. He made his decision. I made mine. And your decision was to be somewhere I could actually do something about it, she said, rather than somewhere I had to watch it happen. Silas was quiet for a long time. The lamp made the barn amber and warm, and outside the wind had picked up and was moving through the darkness with the sound of something that meant the season was truly changing. You could have told me this, he said finally. Before. I could have, she agreed. Would you have believed me? He thought about it honestly. He thought about the man he'd been 2 months ago, going into a marriage he resented, certain he knew what the woman he was marrying was and what she wasn't. No, he said. Probably not. She nodded, once. Not vindicated, but just acknowledging the truth. That's why I didn't. She handed him the lamp and walked back toward the house. He watched her go. The wind pushed at the barn walls, and he could hear cattle moving somewhere to the north, unsettled by something or by nothing, the way cattle sometimes were. He stood there for a while after she was gone, holding the lamp, and thought about the shape of the thing he'd misread so completely. He'd been told his whole life that a man understood his ranch, the ground, the water, the sky, the patterns of things. He'd believed it. He'd been proud of it. He was starting to understand that the version of Clementine Ashcroft that lived in his head bore almost no resemblance to the actual woman who had moved into his house and walked his fence lines and commissioned water surveys and was, right now, in her small bedroom with the good light, reading papers that were probably about something he hadn't thought of yet. He blew out the lamp and walked back to the house. The autumn was going to be hard. He could feel that in his bones, in the particular way the cold was settling, not just over the land but into it, like the season was making a promise it intended to keep. But he thought, for the first time since the letter had arrived on that unremarkable Tuesday, that hard and impossible were not the same thing, that there was a difference between the two, and that the difference might matter. He went inside. The kitchen was warm. In the hallway, the line of lamplight under her door was steady and still. The materials list went up on the barn wall on a Monday. By Wednesday, Deke had looked at it 3 times without comment. By Friday, 2 of the hands had started asking questions. Not of Silas, but of each other, standing near the list in the early morning before work began, voices low, pointing at specific items with the particular thoughtfulness of men who knew enough about ranching to recognize when something was either very smart or very wrong and weren't yet sure which. Silas let it sit. He'd learned, over years of managing men who'd been doing this work longer than he'd been alive, that forcing a reaction was usually worse than waiting for one to develop on its own. Clementine said nothing about the list. She'd put it up without ceremony. No announcement, no explanation, just the list, written in her small, precise hand on 3 sheets of paper pinned side by side. And then she'd gone back to whatever she was doing, which that particular morning had involved a long conversation with Ed Farrow at the fence line between their properties. Silas had watched them from a distance. Farrow was a stubborn man, built wide and low to the ground like a fence post himself, and he'd spent 30 years doing things the way his father had done them and his grandfather before that. He wasn't the type to change course on the word of a woman he'd known for 6 weeks. But when Farrow rode home that afternoon, he rode slowly, which was the way Farrow rode when he was turning something over in his head. The first frost came the following week, earlier than anyone had hoped. It was light, the kind that browned the grass tips and cracked the water in the low troughs but didn't freeze anything through. But it was a signal, and everyone on the range who'd been pretending there was more time to prepare quietly stopped pretending. The hay stores on most properties were inadequate. The water situation on the eastern quarter of the county was, as Clementine had mapped out, significantly more fragile than it appeared on the surface. And the market price for beef had dropped a 3rd time, which meant that selling cattle to raise cash for winter costs would require selling more cattle than anyone had to spare. Silas was at the kitchen table going over numbers that didn't add up in any arrangement when Clementine came in from outside, her coat carrying the cold smell of the morning, and set a folded letter in front of him. "From Ada Tillman," she said. "She wants to meet." He unfolded it. It was 3 sentences written in the careful hand of someone who'd composed and recomposed it several times. Ada Tillman wanted to discuss the water proposal. She could come on Thursday if that was convenient. "She came around," he said. "She always was going to. She just needed to get to the numbers herself." Clementine poured herself coffee and stood at the window. The sky outside was the flat white of an overcast morning, the kind that gave no promises about what it was going to do. "Pharaoh will follow. He'll wait to see if Ada gets burned, and when she doesn't, he'll decide it was his idea." "That's about right," Silas said. "Pharaoh's not a bad man." "No, he's just more afraid of being foolish than he is of being wrong." She said it without rancor. An observation, not a judgment. "There's a difference." Silas looked at her. She was watching the sky, not him, and there was something in her expression that he was starting to recognize. A kind of focused interior calculation that meant she was several steps ahead of the current conversation and was deciding how much of that distance to cover out loud. "Who else?" he said. She turned from the window. "The Birch brothers, if we can get them. Their property sits above the primary channel, and they don't know how much leverage that gives them. If they join willingly, the whole network is easier. If Crow gets to them first—" She shook her head. "We need to move before winter gives everybody an excuse to stay inside and stop thinking. The Birch brothers don't talk to anyone they don't already know." "They know Deke." Silas set down his coffee. "You talked to Deke about this." "I asked Deke whether the Birch brothers were the kind of men who could be reasoned with, or the kind who'd dig in on principle regardless of cost. He said they were reasonable if approached right." A pause. "He offered to go with me. I said I'd ask you first." He looked at her steadily. She returned it without flinching, which he'd stopped finding surprising. "You're asking my permission?" "I'm asking your opinion," she said. "It's your ranch. It's your foreman. It's your county. I can think all I want, but I'm not going to go around you. That's not how I intend to do this." The plainness of it, the absence of any angle or maneuver, hit him somewhere unexpected. He'd been waiting, still, in some untrusting part of himself, for the Ashcroft calculation to show up, for the moment when Clementine's apparent straightforwardness revealed itself as a longer game. The patience of a woman who'd grown up watching her father work, but it hadn't appeared. Either she was more disciplined than anyone he'd ever met, or she was exactly what she seemed, a person who'd decided at some point long before he met her that she would not be what her father was. "Take Deke," he said, "and take the water survey. The full one, not the summary. The Birch brothers will want to see the numbers themselves." She nodded once and finished her coffee, and that was the end of it. Hashem. The meeting with Ada Tillman on Thursday lasted 2 hours and covered ground that Silas hadn't anticipated. Ada was 51, small-framed, with hands that showed every year of the work she'd done, and she'd been managing her property alone since her husband's death, with the kind of sustained competence that people tended to notice without acknowledging out loud. She arrived on time, declined anything to drink, and sat across the kitchen table from Silas and Clementine with a directness that made clear she'd done her own thinking and wasn't here to be convinced of anything she hadn't already half decided. She and Clementine talked numbers for the first hour. Silas mostly listened. He understood the financial side of what they were discussing, but the water engineering was detailed enough that he found himself tracking the logic rather than leading it, which was an unfamiliar position. Ada asked questions he wouldn't have thought to ask, and Clementine answered them, not with the slick fluency of someone who'd prepared a performance, but with the slightly uneven rhythm of someone thinking in real time, reaching for specifics, occasionally saying, "I'm not certain about that piece of it. I'd want to check before committing to a number." That "I'm not certain" was the thing that seemed to settle Ada most. People who had all the answers ready were selling something. People who admitted gaps were working. "The Crow situation," Ada said near the end of the first hour. She said it flat, without inflection, like putting a tool on the table. Clementine looked at her steadily. "You know about it." "I know Whitfield Crow tried to buy my North Water rights in August. I said no. 2 weeks later, my best fence line had holes in it that didn't get there by themselves." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm not stupid." "No," Clementine said. You're not. What I want to know, Ada said, is whether this water arrangement you're proposing is going to make me a target or give me cover, because there's a difference, and I've got 3 hired hands and no sons, and I need to know what I'm walking into. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, and somewhere on the property, one of the horses was objecting to something with a series of irritable sounds. Both, probably, Clementine said. I won't tell you it isn't. If we build this water network and the ranches in it hold together, Crow can't pick us off one at a time. That's the cover. But yes, until it's built and working and the arrangement is too established to dismantle easily, we're going to be a target. Ada was quiet. How long to get to that point? If everything moves the way I think it can. Spring. 6 months. 6 months is a long winter. Yes, Clementine said. It is. Ada looked at Silas. He got the sense she was checking whether there was a gap between what his wife said and what he'd actually commit to, whether they were presenting a unified position or a negotiated one that might crack under pressure. She's right about the timeline, Silas said, and right about the risk. I'm not going to tell you different. Ada looked at him for another moment, then looked back at Clementine. All right, she said. I'm in. But if you leave me exposed, I won't, Clementine said. It wasn't a reassurance. It was a statement of intent, made with the kind of flatness that meant the speaker understood the weight of what they were taking on. Ada heard it that way too, because she nodded once and accepted the coffee she'd declined an hour ago. Tipetseti? Deke came back from the Birch property on a Saturday with mud on his boots and a look on his face that Silas had learned to read over 30 years of knowing him. The look of a man who'd gone out expecting difficulty and gotten something more complicated than that. They're thinking about it, Deke said, which was more than Silas had expected. Cal Birch pulled out her survey and read it front to back right there at the table. Didn't say much. You know how he is. And the brother? Vernon did most of the talking, which means Cal was the one actually deciding. Deke pulled off his coat and hung it. She handled Vernon right. He likes to argue the edges of things, go at a proposal from angles to find where it gives. She let him argue. Didn't get her back up. When he ran out of edge cases, she just said, "Are those all the questions?" and waited. Silas looked across the room at Clementine, who was at the table with the lamp and her papers and was apparently not listening to this conversation, though he'd noticed she was very good at appearing not to listen. "They'll come around," Deke said. "Give it a week." What came around in less than a week, however, was not the Birch brothers. On the following Wednesday, one of the hands named Reyes came in from the eastern pasture with a look that Silas recognized, tight around the eyes, careful, the look of a man who'd seen something and was working out how to say it. He'd found 2 dead cattle near the eastern fence, not from wasting or illness, from something else. The wounds were wrong. Silas rode out with Reyes and Deke to look at them. He stood over the animals in the cold morning air and felt something that moved below anger, something more fundamental, the particular fury of a man watching something that is his, something that cannot be undone, something that was done deliberately. "Crow's moving faster," Deke said quietly. "I know. If he's willing to do this now before winter's even set in?" "I know," Silas said again. He rode back to the house and stood in the kitchen for a moment, not saying anything. Clementine was there. She looked at his face and didn't ask any preliminary questions. "The eastern pasture," she said. 2 cattle, killed deliberately." Her jaw tightened, barely visibly. "Then we don't have the 6 months I told Ada. We have less." "How much less?" She was quiet for a moment, thinking something through. "The cistern construction needs to start by the end of the month, or the ground freeze makes it impossible. The contracts? I've been drafting a shared supply agreement, something that ties the participating ranches together formally enough that Crow can't approach any of them individually without it being visible. But it's not finished." "How long to finish it?" "A week, maybe less if I don't sleep." He looked at her. She was already moving toward the table, toward her papers, with the focused urgency of someone who has recalculated a timeline and is now working backward from the new deadline. She wasn't panicked. She was the opposite of panicked. The kind of concentrated calm that sets in when a person has prepared for difficulty long enough that its actual arrival is, in some strange way, a relief. There's something else, she said, without looking up from her papers. I need to go to town. The Land Commission records, the Water Rights Registry. I want to see whether Crow has filed anything recently. If he's moving this fast, he may be trying to establish prior claim to something before we can counter it. I'll go with you, Silas said. She looked up. There was something in her expression he couldn't quite name. It wasn't surprise exactly. More like an adjustment. All right, she said. Teed. The town of Millard Crossing was not large enough to have secrets, only to have delays in the dissemination of information. And so by the time Silas and Clementine tied their horses at the Land Commission office on a Thursday morning, at least 4 people had already noted their arrival and begun the process of telling 5 more. Silas felt it, the particular weight of a county's attention operating just below the surface of ordinary interactions, every nod and greeting carrying a subtext he'd been aware of since the wedding. He'd developed, in the weeks since, a new sensitivity to how people treated Clementine in his presence. The town was polite to her face. It was always polite to faces. But there was a mode of politeness, formal, slightly elevated, the kind that maintains distance under the cover of courtesy, that was different from the ease people extended to someone they'd decided to accept, and Clementine received the former almost universally. She moved through it without apparent difficulty. She greeted people she recognized by name, inquired after things she'd apparently remembered from previous encounters, and conducted herself with a matter-of-factness that gave no one an obvious opening to be unkind. Whether she'd built that manner deliberately or had simply arrived at it through long practice, Silas couldn't tell. Probably both. The Land Commission clerk was a man named Durwood Stiles, who had worked in that office for 20 years and had the particular quality of someone who knew where every file was and had very strong opinions about being asked to retrieve them. He looked at Clementine with the professional neutrality of a man who'd learned to hide what he actually thought about people making requests of him. Water Rights Registry, Clementine said. For the Eastern Watershed, sections 12 through 19. Anything filed in the last 3 months. Durwood Stiles looked at her. Then he looked at Silas. Then he looked back at her. That's a substantial search, he said. Yes, she said. It is. There was a beat. Silas put his hand on the counter, not aggressive, just present, and Durwood Stiles went to get the files. They found it in the 4th ledger, a filing dated 6 weeks ago under a holding company name that took Silas a moment to parse. Consolidated Grazing Partners, a name that meant nothing on its own, but the address on the filing was a law office in San Antonio that Clementine clearly recognized because her hand stilled on the page. Crow's attorney, she said. That's Crow's San Antonio attorney. What did he file? A prior rights claim on the secondary channel. She was reading quickly, her finger moving along the lines of text. This is wrong. The dates here are wrong. This filing claims continuous use of the channel going back 18 years, but the channel didn't reach this section until... She stopped. Until what? Until my father rerouted it. 12 years ago. She looked up. Her eyes were steady, but something behind them was moving fast. This document is fraudulent. The dates have been altered. Silas looked at the filing. He couldn't read the legal language as quickly as she could, but the date she was pointing to was clear enough, and what she was saying about it was clear enough. Can we prove it? He said. There will be records of the rerouting. My father had a survey done. He always had surveys done. She was already closing the ledger. Durwood, she said, loud enough to carry to the back of the office. I need a copy of this filing, all 4 pages. Durwood appeared from between shelves, looking put upon. Copies take time. I'll wait, she said. Silas watched her while Durwood went through the laborious process of producing copies by whatever method his office used. She stood at the counter with her hands flat on the surface, and he could see her thinking, not the frantic reactive thinking of someone who'd been caught off guard, but the systematic kind, building from what they'd just found toward what it meant and what needed to happen next. Clementine, he said quietly, your father's survey records. I know where they are, she said. He keeps everything. He's not going to hand them over to you. No, she agreed. He's not going to hand them over. A pause. But I know where they are. He looked at her. "You're going to steal from your father." She considered this. "I prefer to think of it as retrieving evidence that's being withheld from people who have a legitimate interest in it. But the technical description isn't wrong." He should have felt more conflicted about this. He didn't, quite. He looked at the ledger, at the fraudulent filing with its wrong dates and its San Antonio law office address, and he thought about 2 dead cattle in the eastern pasture, and about Ada Tillman's 3 hired hands and no sons, and about the Halverson place that was already gone. "When?" he said. She looked at him, really looked at him for a moment, with an attention that was different from her usual careful observation. "You'd come with me." It wasn't a question, but he answered it anyway. "Yes." Something passed through her expression, not relief. She'd been doing this without him for years, in one form or another, and she didn't need his protection. It was something else. The recognition maybe that they were the same side of something, and that this had stopped being a transaction and become an alliance, which was a different kind of arrangement entirely. 2 weeks, she said. "I need the cooperative agreement finished and signed first. I want something in place before we move on the records. Something that makes it worth Crow's attention to challenge legally instead of with hired hands." Durwood returned with the copies. Clementine folded them carefully and put them in her coat. Outside, the cold had intensified. The sky was the color of pewter, and the smell on the wind was the particular mineral sharpness that meant snow was coming, maybe tonight, maybe not for a week, but coming. The street was not busy. A Thursday in late October didn't draw much traffic, but there were enough people about that Silas was aware again of being watched, of being the Mercer man and his big wife, the forced marriage, the joke that was still circulating in 100 small variations through every gathering in the county. He thought about that for a moment. He thought about how wrong it was, specifically, not just unfair in the way that life was often unfair, but wrong in the particular way of things that misread a person so completely that the error reflected more on the people making it than on its subject. He untied his horse, and then untied hers and held the reins while she mounted, which he did automatically, and which she accepted without comment. She'd stopped making small, surprised adjustments to things he did that other people apparently didn't do. He'd stopped noticing that he was doing them. They rode back through town side by side. Someone on the boardwalk, he didn't see who, said something to the person beside them, and there was a sound that might have been laughter. Clementine gave no indication she heard it, neither did he, or tried not to, but his jaw was tight the rest of the ride home. Diet. The cooperative agreement was finished in 11 days, not 14. Clementine had pushed through it with the focused relentlessness of someone who'd internalized a clock she hadn't shared with anyone, working mornings and evenings and some nights in between, cross-referencing legal precedents from books she'd apparently brought in one of her 3 trunks, and annotating every section with the particular notation of someone who expected it to be challenged in court and was preparing for that eventuality from the first sentence. Silas read it twice. He understood most of it and wasn't too proud to ask about the parts he didn't. She explained without condescension, walking him through the structure, pointing out the provisions she'd designed specifically to address the weaknesses Crow's attorneys would look for. Ada Tillman signed it on a Wednesday. Farrow signed it on Friday, as Clementine had predicted, after Ada. The Birch brothers came in together on a Saturday morning, Cal reading every page twice, Vernon making the same 3 arguments he'd apparently made at his kitchen table with Deke, and which Clementine addressed calmly and completely. Then Cal signed, and Vernon signed because Cal did, and 2 other families from the southeastern quarter who'd heard about the meeting came by and signed the same afternoon. 7 names, 7 ranches, an aggregated cattle operation and water network that was, on paper, one of the largest cooperative arrangements in the region. Whitfield Crow was going to know about it within a week. That Saturday evening, after the last of the visitors had ridden out, and the lamp was burning low and the paperwork was stacked and sorted on the table between them, Silas poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of his wife and sat down. She looked up from the final copy she'd been reviewing, slightly hollow-eyed from the days of compressed work. "It's a good document," he said. "It's a necessary document," she said. "There's a difference." Still, he turned his cup in his hands. You built something today. She looked at him with the careful attention she brought to things that mattered. We built something, she said. Don't you start. He almost smiled. All right. Outside the window, the first snow of the season was beginning. Soft and indeterminate, barely visible against the dark, the kind that might amount to nothing by morning or might cover everything by dawn. Either way, it was there now, falling on the Mercer land and on 6 other properties where families had signed their names to a common cause that morning and gone home to worry about whether they'd made a mistake. They probably had made mistakes, some of them. Clementine had made mistakes in the document she wouldn't find until someone found them for her. Silas had made mistakes he wasn't aware of yet. That was the nature of building anything. You made it as well as you could, and then you discovered what you'd missed, and you dealt with it. But the names were on the paper, and the paper was real, and that was something. In a county where everything was being picked apart and purchased and pushed off its foundations one piece at a time, 7 families had said no to that, at least for tonight. The snow kept falling. They sat with their coffee in the quiet house, and neither of them felt the need to say much else. It was, Silas thought, the first evening since October that he'd come inside and felt something that wasn't dread. He didn't have a name for what it was instead. But it was different, and different was enough, for now. The snow that had started so quietly on the night the cooperative agreement was signed did not amount to much by morning. Just a thin coating over the ground that the sun burned off before noon, leaving the grass dark and wet, and the air with that particular cleaned-out smell of cold that had come and gone without committing. Silas had stood on the porch that morning and looked out over it and thought that even the weather in this county couldn't make up its mind about anything. The weeks that followed were the kind that didn't announce themselves as dangerous. That was the thing about the worst stretches. They rarely did. There was work and cold, and the cooperative's construction timeline pressing forward in the way that large undertakings press forward. 2 steps, and then an obstacle, a correction, another 2 steps. The cistern excavation on the eastern quarter had started before the ground froze hard, which was the closest thing to luck they'd had, and the crews from 3 of the cooperative ranches had shown up on the first morning with tools and complaints and the particular energy of men who weren't entirely sure what they'd signed themselves into, but had decided to see it through regardless. Clementine was out there every morning before the crews arrived. Silas had started going with her, partly because he'd told himself he should understand the construction, and partly because he'd stopped pretending, even to himself, that he went where she went for purely practical reasons. She wore the same coat every day, a heavy canvas thing, dark brown, that she'd brought in one of her trunks. And she carried the survey maps in a roll under one arm and talked to the work crews with a directness that had taken some of them time to adjust to. Not because she was unkind. She wasn't. But she didn't soften technical information to make it easier to dismiss, and some of the men had needed a few days to recalibrate their assumption that a woman explaining a drainage grade to them was something they could nod politely at and then do differently. Reyes had adjusted fastest. He'd been the one who'd found the dead cattle, and he'd carried that particular tightness in him ever since. The specific vigilance of a man who knew that something bad had already happened once and was waiting for it to happen again. He listened to Clementine with the attention of someone who'd decided she was a useful source of information, which was the most practical form of respect available on a working ranch, and, in Silas's experience, the most durable. The letter from Whitfield Crow arrived on a Thursday in early November. It was addressed to Silas, which was itself a statement, though they both knew it. Crow's attorney had drafted it, the same San Antonio firm whose address appeared on the fraudulent Land Commission filing, and it was several pages of legal language that compressed, at its core, to a single threat. The cooperative agreement, Crow's attorney argued, violated a county ordinance governing shared water use that had been on the books since 1871, and any construction begun under its terms was subject to a cease order pending legal review. Silas read it at the kitchen table with Clementine across from him, watching his face. "Is the ordinance real?" he said when he finished. "Yes," she said, "but it doesn't apply to what we've built. The 1871 ordinance was written to prevent one landowner from diverting shared water resources for exclusive use. We're doing the opposite." She'd clearly already known about the ordinance, which meant she'd accounted for it. His attorneys are misreading it deliberately, or they're hoping we won't read it at all. Can they get a judge to agree with their reading? She was quiet for a moment. There are 2 judges in this circuit. One would read it correctly. The other... She stopped. The other has ruled in Crow's favor 3 times in the past 5 years. Silas set the letter down. So we need to get ahead of this before it lands in the wrong courtroom. We need to file a counterclaim establishing the cooperative's legal standing before Crow's cease order can be formalized. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. And we need my father's survey records. Now, not in 2 weeks. The plan they'd put aside, the retrieval of Reginald Ashcroft's records, came back to the center of things with the particular urgency of something that had been waiting. Clementine had not brought it up since the Land Commission office. Silas had not brought it up either, both of them, he suspected, allowing the weight of it to settle into something manageable before addressing it. Now it was not a future problem. It was a present one. When? He said. My father is in San Antonio until the 16th. He takes the same trip every November. He has business associates there. She said business associates the way a person says something accurate that they don't want to say. The house will have staff, but not him. I know where the survey records are kept. I know the house. You grew up there. I grew up there, she confirmed. I left 4 years ago. The layout won't have changed. He looked at her. You left 4 years ago. That's before your father approached me with the marriage arrangement. Yes. So you'd already separated yourself from him. I'd tried to. She met his eyes. He found other ways to keep me in the arrangement. That's how fathers like mine work. There's always another way. She said it evenly, without visible emotion, which he'd come to understand was not the absence of feeling, but its compression into something functional. He offered me to you because I was the last piece of leverage he had that I couldn't remove on my own. I couldn't stop the marriage without costing you the ranch. Silas absorbed this. It was the most she'd said, directly, about the architecture of what her father had done, and it reframed the shape of things in a way that sat differently in his chest than it had before. You could have warned me, he said, before October. And said what? A man I'd never spoken to privately? My father is going to offer you a choice you can't refuse? She shook her head. You'd have gone to him directly. He'd have accelerated the timeline and made it worse. I didn't have enough built yet to protect you from that. He was quiet. Outside, wind was working at the eaves. You were protecting the ranch, he said, before you were even here. I was protecting the people on it, she said. There's a difference. He thought about Deke and Reyes and the others. He thought about Ada Tillman with her 3 hired hands. He thought about all the things Clementine had been calculating long before he'd had any idea she existed as more than a name attached to a problem. We go on Saturday, he said, before the weather gets worse. They rode to the Ashcroft house on a Saturday that was overcast and cold enough that their breath clouded ahead of them the whole way. Silas brought Reyes, who was discreet and reliable, and had a talent for not being noticed that Silas valued in present circumstances. Clementine sat her horse with her usual straight posture and didn't speak much during the ride, which he'd come to read as concentration rather than distance. The Ashcroft house was larger than Silas had expected, though it shouldn't have surprised him. It sat at the end of a lane flanked by bare-limbed trees, 2 stories, stone construction, the kind of house that was built to make a point about the man inside it. With Reginald Ashcroft in San Antonio, the grounds had the quiet of a held breath. There was a groundskeeper and a housekeeper. Clementine had apparently anticipated both. She rode up to the front door without hesitation and knocked, and when the housekeeper, a woman of about 60 named Marta, who clearly recognized Clementine with visible surprise, opened it, Clementine said calmly that she needed to collect some of her personal documents from her father's study, and that she'd appreciate Marta's discretion. Marta looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. The study was on the ground floor, east side. Clementine went directly to a cabinet behind her father's desk and found it locked, which she'd apparently expected, because she produced a key from her coat pocket that she'd clearly carried for some time. Silas didn't ask about the key. He stood near the door and kept watch while she worked through the files with quiet efficiency. Not ransacking, not frantic, just methodical, pulling specific folders with the certainty of someone who had organized these files herself once and knew their system even years later. She found the survey records in the third drawer. She found something else in the fourth, a file she hadn't been looking for that made her go very still for a moment before she picked it up and read it. "What is it?" Silas said. She turned. Her face was controlled, but barely. "He knew about the fraudulent filing," she said. "Crow's prior rights claim, the false dates. My father knew. There's correspondence here." She looked down at the papers in her hand. He was advising Crow's attorneys on how to structure it to survive initial challenge. The room was quiet. Outside, Reyes had stayed with the horses. The house held the particular silence of absent people and old decisions. "He was working with Crow," Silas said. "He was positioning himself," she said. "If Crow succeeded in breaking the cooperative ranches, my father would have first purchase rights on the distressed properties. Crow gets the water rights. My father gets the land." She set the papers down, then picked them up again. "And he arranged our marriage to put himself in a position to know, from inside your household, how the resistance was forming, how far it had gotten, what it would take to disrupt it." Silas looked at her. "He sent you in to gather information." "He thought he did," she said. "He misjudged what I would actually do once I was here." It was said without drama. She took the file. She took the survey records. She relocked the cabinet with the key and put it back in her pocket, and she turned to face Silas with an expression that was doing considerable work to remain composed. "Let's go," she said. They rode back hard. Reyes asked no questions. What happened that night did not announce itself either. Silas woke to the smell first, smoke, but wrong, too heavy and too immediate, and then to a sound he couldn't place for a confused half-second before his body understood what his mind was still parsing. The barn was on fire. He was outside before he'd fully assembled the sequence of getting there, and what he saw stopped him in the yard in a way that nothing should stop a man when there are animals burning. The barn was not just burning, it was burning with an intensity and a distribution that told him, in the flat and immediate way that terrible information arrives, that it had been lit from multiple points. The east corner and the west corner were both involved. The hay was gone, a column of orange that had already consumed what little winter stores they had and was working on the structure itself. The horses were screaming. That was the worst of it. That sound, which was unlike anything else in the world, and which Silas would hear in his sleep for months afterward. He got 4 of the 6 horses out. Reyes got the other 2. They worked without speaking, choking in the smoke, the heat on their faces like a physical presence pushing them back. 2 horses they couldn't reach. The fire was too established in the north end where those stalls were, and Silas had to pull Reyes back by the arm when the younger man tried to go again, had to physically hold him while the sound inside changed from something desperate to something final. Clementine had come out behind him. She'd organized the ranch hands in the yard before he'd even gotten the first horse clear, sending 2 for water, positioning the others to keep the sparks from reaching the smaller outbuildings, moving with the authority of someone who had thought through crisis response as a category of problem, not this specific crisis, but the general shape of things going wrong all at once. When the barn was past saving, she came to stand beside Silas. "The cattle," he said. "Reyes checked the south pasture. There—" She stopped. He looked at her. "Someone opened the eastern gate," she said. "Before the fire. The east herd is gone." He stood there in the light of what had been his barn. The east herd was 700 animals, 2/3 of what they ran. Without them, the cooperative contracts Clementine had negotiated were void. Without the contracts, the cooperative itself was financially unsustainable. Without the cooperative, the 7 ranches were back to being individual operations that Crow could pick apart one at a time through winter. This was not impulsive. This was planned. Someone had known about the cooperative well enough to understand exactly what to destroy and in what order. He thought about what Clementine had found in her father's study. The correspondence, the positioning, the marriage that had been, in Ashcroft's mind, a source of intelligence. "Your father told them," he said, "how far along we were, what to target." "Yes," she said quietly. "I think so." He looked at the burning. It was a hard thing to look at, and he made himself look at it anyway because turning away from hard things was how men ended up living smaller than the moment required. "We can't rebuild this in winter," he said, "and we can't honor the cattle contracts without the East herd." "I know." "The cooperative is not finished," she said. "Not yet." She said it with a firmness that surprised him, given everything he'd just said. "Sit with me for a minute." They sat on the fence rail at the edge of the yard, away from the smoke and the hands and the noise of an ongoing disaster, and she talked. What she said was this: the East herd was gone from the eastern pasture, but it hadn't evaporated. Cattle driven at night by men in a hurry don't go far and don't go organized. They scatter. They follow water. In November, in this part of the county, the water they'd follow was the creek system to the northwest, which ran into the drainage basin at the edge of the Farrow property before turning south. If they moved before dawn, not they, Silas and his hands alone, but all 7 cooperative ranches, every person who could ride, they could work the creek basin and the drainage land and recover a significant portion of the herd before it dispersed further. "How many head do you think we can get back?" he said. "I don't know, maybe 300, maybe more if the terrain held them." She paused. "It won't be enough to honor the contracts as written, but there's a provision, I put it in myself, for force majeure. Acts of deliberate sabotage qualify. We can renegotiate the delivery timeline if we have a legal record of what happened tonight." "Who documents it?" "Durwood Stiles is meticulous. We get him out here at first light, before anyone disturbs anything. The gate, the fire origins, everything." She turned on the fence rail to look at him directly. "And we have the file from my father's study, the correspondence with Crow's attorneys. That is evidence of conspiracy, Silas. In the right hands, it ends this." He looked at her in the firelight. She was covered in soot, and her hair had come partially undone from its pins, and she'd lost a button from her coat at some point in the chaos. She looked exactly like what she was, a person who had run toward a disaster and been in the middle of it. And she was also, somehow, the clearest-headed person within 50 miles. "You want to move the entire cooperative tonight," he said. "All 7 ranches. In the dark. Through terrain you've mapped, but most of them haven't." "I want to move them before the herd does," she said. "Yes. Some of them won't come. It's November, it's past midnight, and they'll be scared." "Some of them won't come," she agreed. "The ones who do will be enough." He was quiet for a moment. He thought about what it would cost him to ask this of people. To ride to their homes in the middle of the night, in the aftermath of a fire that was still lighting up the sky, and ask them to trust the plan of a woman. Half of them had met for the first time 8 weeks ago. He thought about what it would mean if enough of them said no. Then he thought about Cal Birch reading the cooperative agreement page by page, about Ada Tillman asking straight questions and waiting for straight answers, about Farrow, who was stubborn and frightened and who had signed anyway. "Deke," he called. Deke materialized from somewhere behind him with the speed of a man who'd been waiting to be called. "I need riders to 4 properties," Silas said. "Now, tonight." Deke looked at him. Then he looked at Clementine. Then he nodded once and went. The next 3 hours were the kind that strip away everything unnecessary about a person. Ada Tillman arrived before her rider did. Almost. She'd seen the smoke from her place, which was elevated enough to have a long view, and she'd already been up and dressed when the knock came. She came with 2 hands and her own horse, and a look on her face that was not panic, but its functional opposite, the focused, forward-leaning attention of someone who has decided to be useful. Farrow took longer. His rider had to knock twice, and then Farrow stood in his doorway in the lamplight for what felt like a long time, asking questions that his rider answered as best he could. He came. He brought 3 men, and he brought the expression of a man who isn't sure about this and is coming anyway, which was, Silas thought, more honest than confidence would have been. The Birch brothers came together, as they did everything, Cal already on horseback when Vernon was still pulling on his coat. By 3 in the morning, there were 14 riders assembled in the yard of the Mercer Ranch, in the orange-tinted darkness of a barn that was subsiding into its own coals. Clementine had the county map spread on the hood of the water wagon, lantern lit, and she talked them through it without preamble, the creek basin, the drainage land, the likely scatter pattern of a herd pushed fast by men who hadn't had time to be organized about it. Nobody laughed at her. Nobody looked at somebody else with the particular sideways look that means a man is checking to see if the other man also finds this absurd. The barn was still burning. That had a way of clarifying things. "The terrain at the northwest bend goes soft," Cal Birch said. He was looking at the map with his head tilted slightly. "Cattle will bog there." "I know," Clementine said. "That's why I want 2 riders holding that line from the east before the main group sweeps through. They'll push the bogged animals back toward the open ground." Cal looked at her. "You've ridden that ground?" "I walked it in October," she said. "It was firm enough then. In November, after the rain we've had, it won't hold much," Cal said. "You're right about that." He straightened up. "Vernon and I'll take the east line." Silas watched this happen. He'd led men his whole life, working them, directing them, maintaining the kind of authority that made a ranch function, and he understood the specific texture of a group of people deciding to follow someone. It wasn't dramatic. It was mostly people looking at a plan and deciding it was better than no plan, which was as much as you could ever ask for. But there was something in the way these men looked at Clementine. Cal Birch, who never did anything without thinking it through, who had read the cooperative agreement 4 times. That was not just the acceptance of a plan. It was the first tentative revision of an assumption. The way a man looks when the ground he was standing on turns out to be different from what he thought. They moved out before 4. The night was cold and moonless, which was bad for visibility and good for not being seen. Silas rode near the front with Clementine beside him, and he was aware of her breathing. Steady, not quite slow, the breathing of someone managing adrenaline rather than being managed by it. "You've done something like this before," he said quietly as they rode. "Not this," she said, "but things where the cost of being wrong was very high." A pause. "You learn to think past the fear, not through it, past it. There's a difference. What happens if we don't find enough of them?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then we regroup and we figure out what's actually available to us, and we make a plan from that." She turned her head to look at him, briefly, in the dark. "I don't have an answer for every outcome, Silas. I have a direction and a decision. That's all anyone ever has." He thought about that as they rode. The darkness ahead was absolute, and the cold was the kind that worked through your coat after a while, regardless of its quality. And somewhere ahead of them in the creek basin, several hundred cattle were doing what frightened animals do, which is move away from whatever scared them and toward whatever smells like safety. The first gray light of dawn was beginning to suggest itself at the eastern edge of the sky when Reyes, riding point, raised his hand and stopped. Silas came up beside him. Ahead, in the pale half-dark of early morning, the land opened into the drainage basin, and across it, moving slowly now, without anyone pushing them, beginning to spread and graze in the way that cattle do when they've decided the emergency is over, was the east herd. Most of them. Not all, but most. Silas sat his horse and looked at them for a moment that felt longer than it was. Beside him, he heard Clementine let out a slow breath. "How many?" Pharaoh said, riding up on his other side. "Can't count from here," Silas said. "But—" He stopped. "But it's enough," Clementine said. "It's enough to work with." She wasn't describing what she saw as a triumph. She was describing it as a starting point, which was what it was. There were still the contracts to renegotiate and the legal filing to make, and the fraudulent land commission documents to challenge, and an entire county of frightened people to hold together through a winter that hadn't even fully committed itself yet. But the cattle were there. The people who'd come in the night were there. And the horizon was beginning, reluctantly, to go light. Silas looked over at his wife. She was watching the herd with the expression he'd come to think of as hers. Not satisfaction, not relief, just that forward-aimed focus, already beyond this moment to the next problem, the next calculation. Her coat was still missing its button. Her hair was still half undone. He'd never thought of her as beautiful, not in the way that word usually operated. But looking at her now, in the gray early light, covered in soot and cold, and completely unbroken, he thought that the word he'd been using was probably the wrong word for the thing he was actually looking at. "Let's get them home," she said. Behind them, 14 riders spread out along the basin in the growing light, and the work of recovering what had been taken from them began. They got 263 head back from the drainage basin. Not 300, not the full East herd, but 263 animals that were cold and agitated and had lost weight overnight that they couldn't afford to lose. And getting them home took the better part of the day because frightened cattle don't move with any efficiency, and the terrain between the basin and the Mercer pastures had two sections that required careful handling. By the time the last of them were through the gate, the sun was already dropping, and every rider in the group had the hollow, used-up look of people who had been awake for 20 hours and running on something other than rest. Silas stood at the gate and counted them through himself, hand on the post, one by one. Clementine stood beside him and did the same thing in her head. He could tell by the way her lips moved slightly, almost imperceptibly, the way they did when she was running numbers. When the last animal was through, neither of them spoke for a moment. "It's not enough for the original contracts," he said. "No," she said, "but it's enough to stay solvent through winter if we manage it carefully." She pulled her coat tighter. The temperature had been dropping since midday, with the commitment of a season that had finally made up its mind. "I need to write to the contract buyers today, before they hear about the fire from someone else. They'll hear within the week regardless. Then we write today and control what they hear first." She turned from the gate. "Durwood Stiles. Did Reyes reach him?" "He was here at first light. He documented everything." She nodded. "Good. The legal filing needs to happen before the week is out. If Crow's cease order gets formalized before our counterclaim is on record, we lose weeks to procedural challenges." She was walking toward the house now, with the deliberate pace of someone who is exhausted but has decided not to acknowledge it because there isn't time. "And the file from my father's study. I need to make copies before we submit anything. I want the originals somewhere safe." "Clementine." She stopped, turned. "You haven't slept," he said. "None of us have." She looked at him with something that was almost impatience, and then the almost impatience softened into something more honest. "I know," she said. "A few hours, then we work." He let it go. He went to help Deke settle the recovered herd and check on the hands, most of whom were in similarly hollowed-out condition, and when he came back to the house 2 hours later, she was asleep at the kitchen table with her head on her arms and the lamp still burning and 3 half-finished letters arranged around her. He turned the lamp down and got a blanket from the chest in the hall and put it over her shoulders without waking her, and then he sat in the chair across the table and looked at the letters she'd been writing and thought about the particular shape of the situation they were in. He'd spent most of his adult life believing that strength was a specific kind of thing, visible, physical, the ability to outwork, outride, outlast. His father had been that kind of strong, and his grandfather before him, and he'd built himself in that image because it was the image he'd been given and it had seemed sufficient. What he was looking at now, the letters, the maps, the file from Ashcroft's study, the cooperative agreement with 7 signatures on it, was a different kind of strength entirely, and it had been operating in his house for 2 months before he'd had the wit to see it for what it was. He sat with that for a while. Outside, the night was fully committed to winter now, the cold no longer suggesting itself but stating itself plainly, and somewhere across the county there were 6 families who'd ridden out in the dark on the word of a woman they barely knew and come back with cattle they'd helped save, and that fact was going to mean something in the morning when they all had time to think about what had happened. Durwood Stiles filed the counterclaim on a Wednesday, which put it on the record 4 days before Crow's cease order was formalized. This was, as Clementine had predicted, significant. It meant the legal dispute would be heard as a contested matter rather than a default ruling, which changed the procedural landscape in ways that were dry and technical. And according to the letter she received from a San Antonio attorney she'd apparently corresponded with before any of this began, very much in their favor. The San Antonio attorney was named Margaret Plum, which was a name that sounded improbable but proved, over the weeks that followed, to be attached to a woman of formidable precision. She was 50-something, had practiced land and water law for 26 years, and she communicated exclusively in letters that were dense with specificity and short on pleasantries. Clementine corresponded with her daily. Silas read the letters and understood roughly 2/3 of them, which was enough to grasp the shape of what was being built. The fraudulent land commission filing was the center of it. With the survey records from Ashcroft's study establishing the actual date of the channel rerouting, the prior rights claim Crow had filed was demonstrably false, not ambiguous, not open to interpretation, but factually incorrect in a way that could be proven with documentation. Margaret Plum's letters made clear that this constituted fraud upon the Commission, which was a serious matter that extended well beyond the civil dispute over the cooperative's water rights. The correspondence between Ashcroft and Crow's attorneys, the file Clementine had found in the fourth drawer, was the second pillar. It established coordination between the two men in the construction of the fraudulent claim, and more critically, established Ashcroft's foreknowledge of the planned sabotage in a letter that was not explicit but was specific enough, in the way of men who think they are communicating privately, to be damning in context. Reginald Ashcroft returned from San Antonio on the 16th, as expected. He learned within a day that his study had been accessed in his absence. He sent a letter to Silas that was several pages of controlled fury dressed as legal language. Silas read it at the kitchen table with Clementine across from him, and when he finished, he set it down and looked at her. "He knows what you took," he said. "Yes. He's threatening to pursue theft charges." "He won't." She said it without hesitation. The moment he files anything, Margaret Plum files the correspondence as evidence in the water rights case, and his role in the fraudulent filing becomes part of the public record. He knows that. She turned her coffee cup. "He's testing whether we understand the position we're in." "We do." Silas looked at her steadily. "This is your father." She met his eyes. "Yes," she said, simply and completely, and he understood that she had already conducted whatever internal reckoning that fact required, probably multiple times, probably over years, and that she didn't need him to make it harder than it already was. "All right," he said. What followed was a period of 3 weeks that had the quality of a long, cold standoff. The legal machinery moving at its own pace, Crow's people quiet, but not gone. The cooperative ranches holding together through the worst of the winter with the particular stubbornness of people who have publicly committed to something and don't want to be the one who breaks first. The cistern construction was paused by the freeze, which everyone had expected, but the distribution network that had been completed before the ground hardened was functioning, carrying water to the eastern quarter and 2 adjacent properties with the reliable, unglamorous competence of something built correctly. The cattle they'd recovered were thin but alive. The ones they hadn't recovered, 112 animals, gone into the general population of the range where they'd be absorbed into other herds or found in the spring or simply lost, were a number that Silas had entered into the ledger with the specific economy of a man recording a hard fact and not dwelling on it. He was better at that now than he'd been in October. He wasn't sure what to attribute that to, except that spending time with someone who processed difficulty the way Clementine did, acknowledging it, accounting for it, moving through it without theater, had apparently been instructive in ways he hadn't been seeking. It was Pharaoh who changed things, though he didn't intend to. On a Thursday evening in December, Pharaoh rode to the Mercer Ranch and asked to speak to Clementine directly, not to Silas, to her, which was itself a notable departure from his previous practice. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that was clearly the result of something he'd been working toward for a while. He had a neighbor, he said, not part of the cooperative, a man named Guthrie, stubborn as a bad weld, who had refused every invitation and several direct approaches, and had spent the past 2 months telling anyone who'd listen that the cooperative was a fool's errand run by a woman who didn't know this land. Guthrie's fencing now ran along the cooperative's north boundary, and in the past week, Pharaoh had discovered that the fence line had been moved, not by much, not dramatically, but enough to push the cooperative boundary back 30 feet along a quarter-mile stretch. "Crow's offering to buy him out," Pharaoh said. "Guthrie's not saying he'll take it, but he's not saying he won't. If Crow gets that property, he gets access to the north water feed," Clementine said, "without it passing through our system." "That's what I figured," Pharaoh said. He was looking at her with the full attention of a man who has revised his estimate of someone and hasn't quite finished doing it. "I didn't know if you'd seen the fence." "I walked it Monday," she said. A pause. "Of course you did." He turned his hat in his hands. "What do you want to do about Guthrie?" She was quiet for a moment. Silas watched her think. He'd gotten good at recognizing the texture of it, the way her gaze went slightly inward while her face stayed still. "I want to go talk to him," she said. Pharaoh looked skeptical. "Guthrie doesn't—" "I know what Guthrie doesn't," she said. "He doesn't respect the cooperative, doesn't trust women in business, and has been saying things about me that I'm going to assume are unkind. None of that is the actual problem." She looked at Pharaoh. "What does Guthrie actually need? Not what does he say he wants. What does he actually need to get through winter and come out the other side with his property intact?" Pharaoh blinked. He clearly hadn't thought about Guthrie in those terms, which was probably why none of the previous approaches had worked. "His water situation is worse than he lets on," Pharaoh said slowly. "He's got one good well and it ran shallow in the drought. He's been hauling since October." "Then he needs water," she said. "Not a philosophy. Water." She stood up. "I'll go Saturday." Silas went with her. He'd long since stopped offering and waiting for her to decide. He simply went, and she'd stopped noting it, and this arrangement had its own kind of ease. Guthrie was a compact, weathered man of about 55, who came to his door with the expression of someone expecting to be sold something he didn't want. He looked at Clementine with the particular blankness that men like him used as a substitute for hostility when they were too aware of basic manners to be openly rude. Clementine didn't introduce herself or explain her presence or set up any context. She said, "Your well ran shallow in the drought. If we connect your property to the Eastern Cistern network, you've got reliable water through spring, and the cost to you is a shared maintenance contribution, which, at your acreage, is $11 quarterly." Guthrie stared at her. "The fence line," she continued, 30 feet on the north quarter. We both know it moved. Move it back and we don't make a formal issue of it, because making formal issues of things takes time and money that we'd all rather spend on cattle." Another silence. Silas stood slightly behind her and to the left and kept his expression neutral. "Crow's people been by," Guthrie said finally. "I know," she said. "Offered me a fair price." "Probably," she said. "Fair for now. Check back in 3 years when he controls the water north of the creek and every property adjacent to his is dependent on his terms." She tilted her head slightly. "You've been out here long enough to know how that ends." Guthrie's jaw worked. He looked past her at Silas with the expression of a man checking whether there was a softer version of this conversation available elsewhere. Silas looked back at him with nothing particular. "She's right," Silas said, "about all of it." Guthrie looked at them both for a long moment. Then he looked out at his land, at the flat, cold expanse of it, and something moved through his expression that was private and complicated, and had to do with things that predated this conversation by decades. $11 quarterly, he said. $11, Clementine confirmed, and you'll drop the fence business. Done. He didn't shake her hand. He wasn't there yet, and probably wouldn't be for a while. But he didn't close the door, and when they rode away, the fence issue was resolved, and there was one more property between the cooperative's north boundary and whatever Crow was planning. Whitfield Crow made his move in January. It was not the move anyone had expected, which was itself instructive. It suggested that the legal pressure from Margaret Plum's filings had closed off the avenues he'd planned to use and forced him to something improvised. 3 men arrived at the cooperative's Eastern Cistern construction site on a Tuesday morning before the work crews got there, and by the time Reyes rode out to check on the overnight equipment, the framing for the primary cistern had been partially dismantled and the survey stakes were gone. It was vandalism rather than destruction, significant but not catastrophic, and it had a desperate quality that was different from the calculated precision of the barn fire. That fire had been planned. This was a man running out of careful options. Silas rode to Ada Tillman's property that afternoon and then to the Birch Brothers, and by evening he'd made the circuit of all 7 cooperative ranches. He sat in people's kitchens and barns and talked plainly about what had happened and what it meant and asked them directly whether they were still in. Not whether they were satisfied, not whether they felt good about things, whether they were still in. It was the most important question, and he wanted clean answers to it. Everyone said yes, including Guthrie, who wasn't technically in yet, but who had apparently decided in the 2 weeks since their conversation that he was moving in that direction because he showed up at the Birch brothers' property while Silas was still there and said, with the minimalism of a man who found stating things plainly physically uncomfortable, "Count me in the same." Cal Birch looked at him. "Since when?" "Since I thought about it long enough," Guthrie said, and sat down. Silas rode home that night with 8 ranches behind him instead of 7, which was not the same as winning, but was the kind of increment that, accumulated enough times, became something that looked like it from a distance. Clementine was awake when he got in. She had the lamp and her papers, as usual, but she wasn't writing. She was reading, or had been, because the book was face down on the table and she was looking at the window when he came through the door. "Guthrie came in," he said. She turned from the window. "I heard he was at the Birch property. Word travels. Always." She looked at him with the attention that he'd come to think of as simply how she looked at things that mattered to her. Directly, without deflection, without the slight angle that people used when they were managing their own reaction to something. "How are they?" "Tired," he said. "Scared, a few of them. But they're in." She nodded. He sat down across from her and she poured coffee from the pot on the stove without being asked and set it in front of him, and they sat together in the warm kitchen while the January wind made itself known at the windows. "Margaret Plum filed the fraud evidence today," Clementine said. "The commission will review the Crow filing within 30 days. If the review goes as it should, and if it doesn't, then we take it to the circuit court with what we have, and we have enough." She paused. "My father retained separate counsel this week. He's trying to separate himself from Crow's exposure." Silas looked at her. "Will it work?" "No," she said. "The correspondence is specific enough. He was careful, but not careful enough, which is—" She stopped, started again. He always underestimated the degree to which written things persist. He thought of letters as conversations. They're not. There was something in her voice that was carefully controlled, and he didn't press on it because there are things a person works through in their own time, and what she had to work through regarding her father was not something he could help with except by not making it harder. "The commission review," he said. 30 days. "Roughly. It could be faster." She turned her cup. "Crow's going to be quiet until he knows which way it falls. The vandalism. That was someone panicking. He'll rein it in now that it's a legal matter with a formal record. And his gunmen?" She hesitated. "I don't think he'll use them again. The risk calculation has changed. When we were a loose collection of struggling ranches, the cost of intimidation was low. Now there are 8 properties, a formal cooperative agreement, documented evidence of fraud, and a San Antonio attorney filing on our behalf." She met his eyes. "We're not invisible anymore. And he knows it." Silas nodded. He drank his coffee and looked at the lamp and thought about the past 4 months in the way you think about something when you're still inside it, but can begin to see its shape. He'd gone into this marriage as a man saving his ranch. He'd been certain about what the ranch was, and what it needed, and what he was capable of providing. He'd been wrong about most of it, not about the land, not about the cattle, not about the work, but about the scale of the problem and the nature of the solution, and most of all about who was capable of seeing what needed to be done. "Clementine," he said. She looked up. He had a number of things he could have said. He'd been composing them in some unfocused way for weeks. Acknowledgments, recalibrations, the various forms of a man admitting that he had misread something important. They all felt inadequate when he tried to assemble them, which was probably appropriate. "I owe you an accounting," he said, "for how I came into this." She was quiet for a moment. The wind pushed at the house and the lamp held steady. "You were honest about it," she said. "That first night in the kitchen, you said you didn't want it." A pause. "I respected that. I'd rather have honest resentment than performed acceptance." "It wasn't—" He stopped. "It's not resentment anymore, whatever it was." She looked at him across the table. She had, he'd noticed over months, a way of receiving things that were offered sincerely. She didn't deflect them, didn't minimize them, but she also didn't make more of them than they were. She just took them in and held them. "I know," she said. That was all. It was enough. More than enough, actually, for people who had learned to communicate mostly in what they didn't need to say. Well, The Land Commission issued its finding on a Thursday in late January, 26 days after Margaret Plum's filing. The Crow water rights claim was invalidated. The fraudulent prior rights filing was referred to the county attorney for further review. And in a subsidiary finding that had not been in any of the documents Silas had read, but which Margaret Plum had apparently been pursuing through a separate channel, the Eastern Watershed was formally designated as a shared resource under the cooperative arrangement, legally protected from exclusive claim by any single landowner for a period of 25 years. The letter arrived at the Mercer Ranch on a Friday morning. Clementine read it twice, which was unusual for her. She generally read things once and retained them. And then she set it on the table and looked at it for a moment with an expression that Silas couldn't quite place. "It's done?" he said. "This part," she said. "Crow will file challenges. His attorneys will look for procedural angles. It'll be another year before it's fully settled." She looked up. "But yes, the center of it is done." He picked up the letter and read it himself. The legal language was dense, but the conclusion was plain. He set it down. 8 ranches, he said. They held. They held, she agreed. He looked at her. The morning light was coming through the east window. The window with the good light, the reason she'd chosen that bedroom. And it caught the side of her face with the particular quality of winter sun, thin and clear, that showed everything without softening it. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "The county's going to talk about this for years," he said, "about how the cooperative formed and what happened with Crow in the legal case. And they're going to tell it the way people here tell things, leaving parts out, getting the sequence wrong, making themselves more central to it than they were." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know that I know how it actually happened, and who did what." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression, not the compression she used to manage difficult things, but something less defended than that, something that had more to do with being genuinely seen than with anything being resolved. "That matters to me," she said finally, quietly, without elaboration. "I know it does," he said. Outside, the January cold was doing what it did, and the Mercer land was under it, and so were 7 other properties connected now by water lines and signed agreements and the particular bond that forms between people who have been in something hard together and come through it still standing. It wasn't over. Crow's legal challenges would drag into spring, and Reginald Ashcroft's separate proceedings would complicate things in ways that weren't entirely predictable. And there were cattle to recover, and a barn to rebuild, and a dozen other ongoing difficulties that a Texas winter in a drought year could be relied upon to provide. But on that Friday morning, with the finding letter on the table between them and the light coming in at the right angle, it was enough to sit with what they'd built and know that it was real and that it was theirs, assembled from months of work that neither of them had done alone. Silas poured the coffee. Clementine pulled his letter toward her again and started making notes in the margin, which was exactly what he'd expected her to do, and which was, he'd come to understand, one of the ways you knew something mattered to her. She immediately started thinking about what came next. He let her work. He drank his coffee and looked out the east window at the land, and thought that this was probably what it looked like from the inside, when something was becoming what it was going to be. Crow's legal challenges lasted 14 months. That was the part nobody talked about later, when the story had been simplified into the version that traveled well. The part where the winning wasn't a moment but a long, grinding accumulation of filings and counterfilings and hearings before a circuit judge who read everything twice and ruled slowly and without drama. Margaret Plum made 4 trips from San Antonio. The cooperative ranches paid her fees collectively, which required 3 separate meetings where people argued about proportional contribution before arriving at a number that nobody was fully satisfied with, which Clementine said privately to Silas was the surest sign that it was fair. Whitfield Crow's final challenge was dismissed in the spring of the second year on a Tuesday. Silas noticed it was a Tuesday and thought of the letter that had started everything and felt the particular satisfaction of a circle closing on itself. The circuit judge's ruling was 11 pages and upheld the commission finding in full. The fraudulent water rights claim was struck from the record. The Eastern Watershed designation stood. Reginald Ashcroft's proceedings were separate and slower and ended differently. The county attorney's review of the land commission fraud had expanded, in the way of such things, to include a broader examination of Ashcroft's other mortgage arrangements in the county, the ones that had seemed like patient business acumen and turned out, under examination, to have involved documentation that had been handled with the same creative approach to dates and terms as the water rights filing. He did not go to prison. Men like Reginald Ashcroft rarely did, because they had enough money to interpose lawyers between themselves and consequences until the consequences found a shape they could manage. But 3 of his 11 mortgages were voided by the court, and his legal costs consumed a significant portion of the capital he'd spent 2 decades accumulating, and he was required to divest himself of 2 properties that he'd acquired through the arrangements the court found improper. One of those properties was returned to the Halverson family, who had lost it in the first year of the drought. They were back on their land by summer, which was not a common outcome for people who'd lost property in those years, and which Clementine had apparently worked toward through a specific provision in the legal filings that Silas hadn't noticed until Margaret Plum mentioned it in a letter. He asked Clementine about it. "The Halversons had children," she said, as if this explained everything. Then, because she could see it didn't entirely. It wasn't complicated to add. It just required that someone think to add it. He looked at her for a moment. "You thought of it." "Someone had to," she said, and went back to what she was doing. That was the version of Clementine that the county took longest to absorb. Not the strategist, not the woman who'd reorganized their water system and drafted the cooperative agreement and ridden into a drainage basin in the dark to recover stolen cattle. Those things could be acknowledged as competence, and competence was a category people were comfortable with. What was harder was the Halverson provision. The $11 quarterly deal with Guthrie. The way she'd talked to Ada Tillman in the kitchen that October afternoon. Straight questions and straight answers. No performance of softness, just the genuine article. Those things didn't fit the category of competence. They fit something else. Something the county didn't have a ready word for when applied to a woman they'd been mocking since she was 12 years old. The adjustment was slow and imperfect, and some people never made it, which was the truth of the matter, and there was no point prettifying it. Pete Garver died without revising his opinion of anything. The men who'd made the jokes at the saloon found other things to talk about, and mostly didn't acknowledge the prior conversation, which was its own kind of accounting. The county moved on the way counties do. Not by confronting what it had gotten wrong, but by slowly incorporating the new information into a revised version of itself that didn't require anyone to admit they'd needed revising. What actually changed, the thing that mattered, was more specific than general county opinion. It was the people who'd ridden out in the dark. Ada Tillman, who came by on a Thursday afternoon in March of the second year, ostensibly to discuss the spring cattle assessment, and who sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours talking about everything and nothing, the way people do when they've decided someone is worth spending time with. Cal Birch, who consulted Clementine before he made any significant decision about his property, and who, when asked why by his brother, said simply that she'd been right more times than she'd been wrong, and he wasn't in the habit of ignoring that. Farrow, who never became warm exactly but became reliable, which in Silas's experience was worth considerably more. Guthrie surprised everyone, including himself. He joined the cooperative formally in the spring, paid his first quarterly fee without complaint, and showed up at the first cooperative assembly, a meeting Clementine had organized to discuss the coming year's operations, and sat in the back and said nothing for the first hour. Then someone raised a question about the North Pasture water distribution and got it wrong, and Guthrie corrected them with 3 sentences that were accurate and useful, and that was that. He was in. But the barn was rebuilt in the spring of the first year, which was faster than Silas had thought possible and slower than it needed to be, which was the condition of most things worth building. The cooperative ranches sent labor, not out of charity, which would have been refused, but as a formalized work-share arrangement that Clementine had written into the cooperative's operating agreement in November, which meant it could be reciprocated when any member property needed it. This distinction mattered to the men who showed up with tools. They weren't helping. They were participating in a system that would help them in turn. The difference was dignity, and dignity mattered out here in ways that city people didn't always follow. The new barn was larger than the old one. Silas hadn't planned for that. The original intent was to replace what they'd lost. but the design that emerged from a conversation between Clementine and two of the hands incorporated dimensions that anticipated growth rather than restoration. And when he'd looked at the plans and started to say something about scale and cost, she'd laid out the 3-year cattle projection she'd been working on, and he'd looked at it for a while and said, "All right." She was right about the projection. She usually was, not because she was infallible, but because she built her estimates from the ground up, accounting for what was likely to go wrong rather than assuming it wouldn't, which meant that when things went wrong, she'd already left room for it, and when they didn't, the numbers came in better than expected. Silas had taken to looking over her projections before she finalized them, not to correct them, but to understand them. And this process had become one of the regular textures of their evenings. The lamp, the papers, the back and forth of two people who had developed, over months of compressed difficulty, a working language for thinking about hard things together. The cattle operation grew steadily and without drama, which was the best kind of growth, the kind that doesn't attract attention until it's too large to ignore. By the 3rd year, the cooperative brand, a simple registered mark that Clementine had designed and filed before anyone else had thought to, appeared on cattle that sold at consistently higher prices than unaffiliated ranches in the region because buyers knew what it meant. Animals from an operation with stable water, consistent feed management, and a legal arrangement that had survived being tested. Trust was worth something. She'd known that before she'd come here. She'd built the conditions for it anyway. It was the 4th year when people started coming. Not to visit, to learn. A rancher from 3 counties west arrived one afternoon asking about the water distribution system. 2 brothers from north of the county line wrote a letter requesting to see the cooperative agreement, which Clementine copied for them without charge and annotated with explanations of the provisions they'd most likely have questions about. An agricultural surveyor who was traveling through stopped and asked to speak to whoever had designed the cistern network, and spent an afternoon with Clementine that began as a professional inquiry and ended as something closer to a genuine conversation between 2 people who found the same things interesting. Silas watched this happen from the near distance of a man who was present for all of it. He'd always been the public face of the Mercer Ranch, the one who went to county meetings, who shook hands at the feed store, who carried the name that the land was attached to. That hadn't changed exactly. But the people who came to learn weren't coming for him. They were coming for what she'd built, and increasingly they were coming for her directly. And he watched the county adjust to this in real time with the slightly dazed quality of a place that has been required to revise something fundamental about itself and is still working out what that revision means. He thought about what it would have looked like if he'd been a different kind of man. The kind who needed to be the most capable person in the room, who felt another person's competence as a subtraction from his own. He knew men like that, had grown up around them, understood the architecture of that particular insecurity because he'd felt versions of it himself, in the early months, before the situation had stripped away everything he didn't actually need. He thought about how differently this could have gone, how the thing they'd built could have been prevented by a man too proud to let his wife think in front of him. He wasn't that man. He hadn't known that about himself going in, hadn't known it because he'd never been tested in quite this way. But he wasn't. And that turned out to matter more than most of what he'd believed about himself before October. 5 years after the wedding that nobody had wanted, Silas was at the Eastern Cistern, fully operational now, the largest in the cooperative's network, the one that fed 8 properties through the system Clementine had sketched on the kitchen table that first real night of their marriage, doing the kind of maintenance check that a well-built system still required, because well-built was not the same as self-maintaining. He heard her before he saw her. That deliberate walk, the one he'd been able to identify by sound since November of the 1st year. She came and stood beside him and looked at the cistern with the evaluating gaze she brought to everything she'd made, not admiring it exactly, but checking it against some internal standard, looking for what needed attention. "The Peraltas want to join," she said. The Peralta family ran a mid-sized operation 40 miles southeast, too far to connect to the water network, but the cooperative had, over 4 years, expanded beyond water into shared legal resources, collective cattle contracts, and a seed and feed purchasing arrangement that saved each member property a significant amount annually. Distance was less prohibitive than it had been. "What do you think?" Silas said. "I think we should meet them first." She paused. "I spoke to the wife last month at the regional assembly. She understood the agreement faster than most people do. That's usually a good sign. He looked at her. You were already thinking about it last month. I'm always thinking about something, she said. It wasn't defensive, just true. He turned back to the cistern. The water level was where it should be. The distribution gate was functioning correctly. He ran his hand along the stone rim of it, felt the solidity of the thing, the weight of what had been built here by people who'd shown up in the dark and trusted a plan they hadn't had time to fully understand. Can I ask you something? He said. You can always ask me something, she said. I don't promise to answer. When you made the choice to actually come here, to go through with the marriage instead of finding some other way out, what were you thinking? She was quiet for a moment. The spring air moved over the pasture, carrying the smell of new grass and the distant sounds of the ranch going about its work. I was thinking that I'd spent 4 years watching what my father did and being unable to stop any of it, she said. And I was thinking that being here, even on these terms, was the one position where I might actually be able to do something. A pause. I was also thinking that I didn't know you at all, and that was a significant risk, and I was afraid. He looked at her. She was still looking at the cistern. You were afraid, he said. I'm not made of stone, she said. I'm just organized about fear. I don't let it make decisions, but it's there. She glanced at him briefly. Were you asking because you wanted to know or because you wanted to tell me something? He almost smiled. 4 years of this woman, and she still caught him. Both, probably. Then tell me. He thought about how to say it, and then he decided that the problem with trying to find the right words was that it implied there was a more correct version of what he meant than the plain one. There wasn't. I'm glad it was you, he said. Not glad about how it happened, but glad it was you. She turned to look at him fully. The evaluating gaze, the one she brought to things that mattered, and then something that opened up behind it. Not sentimentality, not performance, but the genuine response of a person who has been offered something real and is receiving it as such. I'm glad it was you too, she said. Eventually, he repeated. You weren't easy at the beginning. Neither were you. No, she agreed. I wasn't. They stood at the cistern in the spring morning, and this was not a grand moment, not the kind that announced itself as significant. It was just two people standing next to something they'd built, talking with the ease of people who had run out of reasons to be careful around each other, which was its own kind of arrival. The ranch behind them was the largest single cooperative operation in the region. It employed 31 people across 8 member properties. It had survived a fraudulent legal attack, a barn fire, a cattle theft, a hard winter, and the slow restructuring of a county that had needed restructuring. It would face other things. Drought would come again, markets would move, the legal landscape would shift. And when those things came, the people who had signed their names to the cooperative agreement would deal with them the same way they dealt with everything else. Imperfectly, sometimes badly, arguing about proportional contributions and making mistakes that required correction, but doing it together rather than alone, which was the only thing that had made the difference. None of it had been inevitable. That was what Silas thought about sometimes. In the honest way you think about things when the immediate pressure is off, and you have room to look at the shape of what happened. It could have gone differently at a dozen points. He could have been a different kind of man. She could have been a different kind of woman, the kind her father had perhaps expected her to be, manageable and quiet and useful in narrow ways. The county could have broken apart under pressure, the way counties did when they were full of people too frightened to hold together. But it hadn't. Not because of destiny or fate or the intervention of anything outside the choices that actual people made on actual days when they were tired and scared and not sure they were doing the right thing. Clementine had made choices. Silas had made choices. Ada Tillman and Cal Birch and Farrow and eventually Guthrie had made choices. 14 people riding out in the dark before dawn on the word of a woman most of them barely knew. That was a choice, made by individuals, one at a time, each of them deciding that the alternative was worse. This was what Silas had come to understand that he hadn't understood before. Strength wasn't the thing he'd thought it was. It wasn't the capacity to carry things alone, or to need less than other people, or to know without asking. Those things had their uses, but they weren't sufficient. What was sufficient, what actually built anything that lasted, was the willingness to be in something with other people, to let them see what you didn't know, to trust that what they brought was worth more than what you lost by admitting you needed it. Clementine had known this going in. She'd been practicing it, in the conditions available to her, since long before she'd arrived at this ranch. He'd had to learn it the hard way, which was, he suspected, the only way most people learned it. He didn't regret the hard way. It had taught him something the easy way wouldn't have. "The Peraltas," he said. "Set up the meeting." She nodded, once, and turned from the cistern toward the ranch house, and he fell into step beside her, which was where he'd been for 4 years now and where he intended to remain. The spring was coming in fully, the grass greening up along the eastern pasture, the water running at the right level through the system they'd built from a sketch on a kitchen table in a marriage that nobody had wanted, and that had become, through work and difficulty and the slow revision of everything both of them had assumed, the thing they would have chosen if they'd known what they were choosing. They walked back to the house together. The day was full of ordinary things that needed doing, which was the truest measure of a life that was working. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of enough to make difficulty worth it. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything.